Welcome to Alternate Endings.
Half audiobook.
Half podcast.
Full apocalypse. On this episode, we bring you a short story about a possible fate of the human race. By the end, can you guess what happened?
This story is titled Heavy Forecast, written and narrated by Ivan Wayne. Part 1. Kendra. Kendra had been pacing around her room so long she began worrying if the floor may cave in with her next step and present her downstairs neighbor with a sudden surprise. If biting her nails had been her vice of choice, she most certainly would have chewed her fingers to the bone, but she didn't chew her nails anymore, and her floor was intact, for now. Why? Why did she have to feel this way? Dylan and her shared plenty of valuable, fun days. There had been several months where she felt inclined to stay with Dylan and could see him as her someday husband. But that was over now. Something changed between them along the way. Part of the frustration was laced with that irritating lack of any one thing she could identify as being wrong with him. They just lost it. Whatever it was, it flew out of their lives at some point and did not return. And yeah, she had broken up with him, and she had already waited too long to do so. The last few months of their tattered relationship dragged out, raking Kendra across an endless grave of doubt and self-loathing. She had loved him. He was the second guy she said I love you to. No, third. Dylan was the third guy she had told she loved him. And now, they were done. And it was her choice, her fault. She should be moving on, sighing a deep breath and thinking herself it's all finally over. And yet, here she is, stuck in her own mind and her own apartment. This stupid storm everyone is worried about is blowing in, keeping her here. Some massive hailstorm, apparently. If the weather wasn't doom and gloom, she could go to someone's house or just get out of her own apartment. Maybe talking to Dylan at his place could help. The phone rang. She flinched. What if it was Dylan? Kendra sprinted across her room and grabbed the phone. The screen forced Kendra to swallow her disappointment. Dad? Why was Dad calling right now? Hello? Kendra, he sounded frantic. You need to take cover. Stay inside. Get somewhere safe. Where are you? I'm home? Why? The hailstorm is about 30 minutes out from me right now. Dad, don't you think they hyped this up a little much? It's just hail. This is coming off the ocean. We have no idea what the hail or storm will be like. It's massive and could be some of the worst hail we've ever seen, they said. He sounded incredibly concerned, like he ran to the phone in a panic before calling. Then again, Kendra knew her father was usually suspect for the dramatic flair when it came to anyone he knew being in danger. Growing up, Kendra saw her dad watch news stories about forecasts and possible dangers to the family, and he would always overreact. It would always be the end of the world, and yet the world was always still here afterwards. Somewhere along the way, Kendra developed a numb and diminished response to her dad's sensational preparedness. Dad, I've been here through 2 hurricanes, and there wasn't anything that I didn't survive. This is not a hurricane. It's supposed to be some of the most severe hail ever recorded, honey. We keep hearing about it, and we live all the way up here in Missouri, far, far away. The storm cell is almost twice as high as most hailstorms. Some people even left Houston, honey. They evacuated. You probably should have done that. But too late now. We don't really know how bad the storm is going to be. Dad, I am home. My car's in my garage. I live on the 2nd story of a 4-story apartment building. I should be okay. Hail falling down isn't going to come sideways into my window. It could if the wind was right. Kendra sighed. Why couldn't this have been Dylan on the phone, warning her of the storm, asking if he should come over? He could offer to hold her hand and ask if she was okay. Then they could talk things over while all this hail, rain, or whatever it was going to be moved on. She could have some peace of mind and quit worrying herself to death about whether she made the right choice or not. Would Dylan come over if she asked? Would he be interested? Or is he done? Her father continued. You don't understand. I know you think I'm overreacting. I do overreact here and there, I will admit that. But your mother agrees with me this time. Do you know how big the storm is now? Your mom keeps telling me to ask you if you know. How big? Kendra said, trying to sound curious as if her question weren't purely hypothetical. It'll hit Mexico by the end of the night, and the other end of this storm pushes out past Florida. It covers half the United States. Isn't that normal hurricane size? It's just a big storm. The biggest hurricanes ever, maybe. But dear, again, this is not a hurricane, like I said before. This is hail. Possibly the biggest hailstorm ever. It's not going to act like a hurricane, and it's not predictable. We haven't had a glimpse of how big the hail pieces are yet. You know how the weather has been lately. Things keep getting worse, like people have predicted for a while now. What if this storm is a lot worse than they think? Despite his paranoia, Kendra did know that weather incidents had been escalating these last few years. It seemed like every month now something awful happened somewhere new. Every time she opened her phone, there was another unusual weather incident killing some amount of people. She had gotten used to it. The oddest one lately, though, one of the incidents to actually catch her attention was this series of tornadoes that hit Northern California. Kendra wasn't sure, but she didn't think California was supposed to get tornadoes. And it wasn't typical for anywhere to get an entire series of tornadoes that hit multiple towns in the same day, killed hundreds of people, crushed entire buildings. She saw a car that had been placed in a second-story window, as if gently placed there, like some sort of odd promotion. There was a viral video her friend showed her of someone seeing 3 tornadoes in one camera shot. The person filming was screaming, understandably, looking around and seeing multiple tornadoes at once. Now, that would be something to freak out about. Not some hailstorm that's wider than Texas, coming in off the ocean. Dad, what am I going to do? Where would I go if I only have 30 minutes? I am home. It's just a bad hailstorm. I'm protected here in this building. Well, do you know your first-story neighbors? Kind of. Not really, though. Do you know anyone on the first floor in your complex? First floor? No, but it's not a tornado. Why would I need the first floor? Kendra, he sighs. She knows he has good intentions, but this has gotten old by now. This always happens. But unexpectedly, Kendra felt a pang of guilt as she tried to calm herself. It was her turn to let out a big sigh. She realized this is a man simply looking out for his only daughter, and if he gets a bit overzealous about weather patterns and danger, he does so out of pure intentions and love. Crazed, panic love, but love nonetheless. And this was better than a dad who never called, never worried, and who wouldn't care where his daughter was in the supposed biggest hailstorm of the century. Dad, she said, smiling. Okay, my bathroom is away from any windows. I'll get in there when I hear the hail starting. I can call you if I get nervous or if anything bad happens. And, Dad, I appreciate you calling and telling me. I'm sorry if I seem dismissive. It's been an odd week for me, and I hadn't really told you all yet, but I broke up with Dylan a few days ago. I know we were back and forth for so long, and you all were sick of hearing about it, but I wanted to wait to let you all know until enough time had passed. But I guess here we are, and it's been in my head all week. The line was quiet. Silent, actually. Dad? No answer. The call ended. Kendra looked at her phone a moment, seeing if he would call back. She knew her dad's poor heart had begun drumming and his pulse was quickening with each passing moment as he tried to call her back. Her smile dropped inch by inch as her phone failed to alert of his urgent call back. She decided to call him herself. The phone took a while to make any noise, and then a busy tone? Did anyone have a busy tone anymore? That's odd. Dropping her phone back down, she stared at the screen. Walking over to the window, Kendra held her phone in her hand and looked outside. She kept a grip on her phone, waiting for it to ring any second now with her dad on the other side, sounding out of breath, asking if she was okay. The clock ticking a bit past 1:35 p.m., Kendra didn't know if she had ever seen a storm so dark during the day. She could have easily mistaken the view outside her window for a midnight scene. She lived in a very busy part of Houston. Plenty of shops and restaurants around her complex, and yet not a moving car in sight. Nobody in the parking lot. Nobody on the streets outside their complex. She could see adjacent businesses and nothing. No one. 0 cars. 0 people. Nobody was outside and no one was driving. For the first time that day, Dylan was not the primary focus of Kendra's attention. A creeping sensation settled on the back of her mind as she began desperately wishing she was still hearing her dad's warnings and advice. She wanted to ask him more questions, hear his concerned voice, and ask her dad if this storm really was going to be that bad. What else had those weather predictions said? Kendra picked her phone back up. Waited. Silence. Busy tone. Shit, Kendra said aloud. Looking back out her window, she saw a car moving slowly down the road. She stared at them, wondering what they thought of this doomsday, icy ball storm. Did their dad call them to warn them? Were they annoyed at their parents' concern? Or would this all just be an overhyped waste of everyone's day? Glancing at her phone once more, she thought, what the hell? Kendra held up the phone to her ear and waited. Silence. Busy tone. Nothing. She hesitated and wondered if she should call Dylan. It would be a way to check and see if the error was on her side of the call and not her dad's. Maybe the towers were getting mixed up between here and St. Louis. She could tell Dylan that she was just testing the phone out. But that would be mean. It would get both their hopes up. She imagined an awkward silence where neither of them knew what to say past hello. Kendra was not aware the biggest hailstorm ever recorded was on its way, and that this storm would soon kill more people in Houston alone than any other natural disaster to ever hit Texas. She was equally ignorant the cell phone service was being interrupted by the wind and massive chunks of ice falling from the sky, hitting land a few minutes ago, crumpling cell towers, disconnecting power lines, and wiping out any structure with any form of weakness. She was also not privy to the eventual information that this incoming storm included some tornadoes of its own, and included some pieces of hail spanning a diameter larger than 30 inches, and would have the highest death toll of any natural disaster in world history. Instead, Kendra looked out the window and waited for this fabled hailstorm to arrive. She wondered what Dylan was doing and if he was thinking about her. Was he home with his parents? She was sad for him. Well, for both of them. Did he wish they were still together? She looked at her phone again, wondering if she should call him. Lightning struck a nearby building outside her window, causing Kendra to drop her phone, almost stumbling backward into her couch. She looked outside, noticing the wind now rising, sweeping across the grass and disturbing the trees. Without picking her phone up, Kendra kept her eyes on the impending storm outside her window, and began wishing nothing more than to listen to her dad ramble on about the weather again. Something moved above. She thought she was hallucinating. A dark, thin tail dropped out of the black tabletop in the sky. Every bit of hair on Kendra's body prickled as she watched a tornado form a gentle connection with the ground a few blocks from her window. The wind was viciously ripping trees back and forth. Didn't her dad say this hailstorm was supposed to be 30 minutes away? None of that mattered now. She watched the tail grow a bit wider and slowly began dragging through Houston. Lightning flashed, and Kendra thought she was staring into a lesser-known sideshow of hell. Without blinking, she watched this tornado rip into one of her favorite coffee shops that she used to frequent when she wanted to get shit done but didn't feel like being at home. Within seconds, the building was unrecognizable. To her right, something caught her vision, and her eyes fluttered. Another tornado linked itself to the ground, as if a dark, thin finger emerged from the earth and linked with a tail from the sky. That was the moment she decided it would be best to make it to her bathroom. However, her bathroom would not protect her like she had hoped. In the next 2 minutes, that second tornado became quite large and made a direct path through Kendra's apartment building. Her mind seized as her floor rumbled and the power went out. All she could think to do was call her dad again as the windows to her apartment blew in. The noise from outside was too loud to hear anything, and she began screaming into the phone, unaware if anyone was on the other end. As the tornado consumed the apartment complex, Kendra was impaled with debris from her crumbling building, and she did not have to wait for the hail to arrive. After eventually finding out Kendra died in her own home, her dad did not forgive himself. That is, until he bought a plane ticket and visited the wreckage for himself a few days later. When he saw that concrete slab and plumbing were the only intact pieces remaining from his daughter's building, he relinquished some of his self-loathing. And he forgave himself. She wouldn't have survived anyway. Many people visited Houston in the coming months to find some semblance of closure for their loved ones. And other people found themselves traveling south to keep looking for people they loved who were not yet found. Part 2. Dylan. Why did he leave his house? Why did he decide to drive in this stupid storm? Some people said this would be the worst storm Houston had ever seen. His parents told Dylan their story about Hurricane Harvey and how that used to be considered the worst storm Houston had endured. Then it was replaced by Hurricane Trevor. But now what? They didn't seem too scared of this hail wall coming in off the ocean. He didn't ask their permission to leave, but he didn't think they minded too much. It's not like either of them chased him down the street, waving their arms back and forth, pleading him not to drive away. And Dylan was going to leave that house even if he had to drive to the center of a hurricane. If he had stayed inside his room any longer, he might have lost an irreversible shred of sanity. Dylan needed to talk to her, tell her how he felt, apologize, and see if she would be willing to give things another chance. He had really screwed things up, but now he could fix it. She texted him and asked him to come over in this storm and that she was scared. She heard how severe the storm and she was nervous now. Was this an excuse? Or did she really think Dylan coming over would make her feel better? Was she not torn in half about everything? Did she not feel kind of gross sending him those invitations as the weather grew near and the storm blackened the sky in a scrambled blanket of rain and hail? Driving across town, you would think it was the middle of the night. The hail hadn't started, just rain so far. But it was so dark. Nerves crawled over his skin like tiny little ants. But was her apartment where he should be going right now? He couldn't help but feel guilty. She wasn't supposed to be the one texting him. Not today. Not months ago. But it was always her. It had been her for a long time now. And right now, on the precipice of this historic hailstorm, she wanted Dylan to be near her. She would always lure him, telling him she needed him so badly right then. It could never wait, and inevitably Dylan would give in, going to her place, finding himself at her place for a chance to hold her again, smell her, be wrapped in her eyes, and feel at peace for a moment. Lightning struck a building off to Dylan's left. He jumped, jerking the wheel a bit. He corrected and noticed his heart rattling around, trying to escape his ribs. He hoped to make it to Sierra's apartment before the hail picked up. The truck already had dimples from the last two major hailstorms, so wouldn't be anything new. Replacing the windshield each time brought Dylan zero joy, so parking under Sierra's covered parking space was a tipping point for his decision to leave in the middle of this supposed storm. Sierra had been on Dylan's mind for a lot longer than just today. Things with Kendra had still been nice when he first met Sierra. Sierra had transferred jobs from Dallas, and Dylan noticed her during her second day there at work. He didn't talk to her for a while, but they eventually crossed paths. The first time he slept with Sierra after work coincided alarmingly well with the time things began unraveling with Kendra. Thunder clapped overhead without any accompanying lightning. His hands tensed and gripped around the steering wheel, rocking back and forth. He didn't like to consider the last few months with Kendra. She never knew about Sierra, about his secrets. He was too much a coward to ever tell her. He couldn't even break up with her and give her some flimsy lie about it being him, not her. He couldn't tell her he needed space or a break. Nothing. Instead, he retracted and shut down. He became cold, apathetic. Dylan did nothing but continue to visit Sierra when he could, and waited for Kendra to end things instead. Sierra didn't mind. He suspected she enjoyed the secrecy and the sneaking around behind some other girl's back. Maybe that's all Sierra was after anyway. He sighed. Hopefully Kendra was okay. Up here in a few miles, if he had turned right and went a few more blocks, he would see Kendra's apartment complex. But she never texted him and asked him to come over. Instead, it had been Sierra. He wondered if Kendra was scared, and if she was doing all right. Her dad probably called her and gave her the 10-step hailstorm survival rundown. He was a great guy, don't get him wrong, but Dylan couldn't get over how anxious Kendra's dad was about anything remotely threatening. Nope. Instead, Dylan was turning left at this next light and heading straight to Sierra's apartment. Excitement bubbled in his stomach as it mixed and blended with nervous anticipation. He hadn't been to her place in nearly 3 weeks. Waiting for the light to change, Dylan noticed there was no other traffic on the road around him. Had he even seen a car since he left his house? That churning excitement in his belly corroded into a heavy dread as he wondered if he had underestimated this storm. He flipped his headlights on. Nobody was around, but better safe than sorry. Especially in this rain, he should have had his headlights on already anyway. Dylan became aware of a rising noise to his right. Looking out the passenger side window across the adjacent field, he saw the wall of hail approaching. Any thought of Kendra, Sierra, or anything else vanished as his eyes landed on a dark blue curtain skirting towards him. The hail bouncing off the ground was visible from a greater distance than he would have expected. Looking forward, Dylan slammed his foot on the accelerator and blew through the light. He floored it, not giving a shit about speed limits or any other cars. There was a bridge up ahead in about a mile or so, and he intended to be underneath that overpass when the hail arrived. The noise grew louder, a volume you would not understand unless you were there, in a vehicle pushing the engine in order to plow through standing water on a slippery road, but still being able to hear the pushing, clawing wall of falling ice behind you. Looking in his rearview mirror, engine roaring, the wall seemed about the same distance as before. He relaxed a little bit, thinking he could make it to the bridge in time at this speed. The distance now seemed to grow a bit further. He realized he was outpacing this front. He tried to slow his breath and place both hands back on the wheel. As his eyes fell on the road in front of him again, he swerved. A car pulled out in front of him from the right. "Son of a bitch," he yelled, yanking left. Intentionally attempting not to overcorrect, Dylan straightened back out. He was still in the oncoming lane of traffic, but it didn't matter. There was no other traffic on this road except for the car that almost just smashed into him. Their headlights beamed behind Dylan as he edged closer to the bridge. He could see it up ahead now. This other car didn't seem to be driving fast enough. Maybe they were scared of going too fast? What did he care? They almost hit him. They're idiots. Dylan tried to remember if he had a green light or not when he went through the intersection. He was almost sure he did, which meant they ran the light. Oh well, doesn't matter. He wrung his hands around the steering wheel again. The gap between their headlights and his truck grew further apart. The curtain still trailing behind them, other hail pieces began to drop. Tiny pebbles bounced off his hood and rattled around the bed of his truck. Forgetting he was trying to speed, Dylan had let off the accelerator after swerving to avoid that jackass. Seeing the bridge just ahead, Dylan floored the accelerator again. Looking in the rearview mirror, he saw the headlights flicker. Before he was able to decide if the car had skipped behind the ominous navy blue curtain, a chunk of hail slammed into his right front fender. Out of his peripheral sight, Dylan saw the solid white object break into smaller chunks. The noise startled Dylan bad enough that his foot slipped off the accelerator and he began slowing down again. The truck veered right, out of his control. His ears were ringing, and he tried to pull the vehicle left, but the steering wheel began insisting on grinding to the right. Chunks of the hail piece bounced off the windshield. One of the pieces that thankfully missed his windshield spun off to the left and seemed bigger than a baseball. That couldn't be right, though. Leaning up and looking over, he saw his hood was crumpled. Holy shit. That piece of hail crumpled the side of his hood, and there was a massive dent, and the way the steering wheel resisted Dylan's input suggested it also blew his tire out. Without much thought, Dylan placed his foot squarely back on the gas again, tugged left on his wheel, and forced his limped truck to the finish line and underneath that overpass. The steering was gravitating extremely hard towards the right, enough to make Dylan wonder if something else other than just the tire had been damaged from that impact. How big had that hail piece been? Was that one slice of hail really larger than a baseball? Hopping out of the truck without bothering to turn it off, Dylan looked back down the road, and he heard the unaltered noise of this impending hail front for the first time. The growing assault on his hearing sounded like overwhelming crackling, static, and popping. He didn't have to yet, but Dylan suspected soon he was going to have to cover his ears when that wall of ice arrived. He saw the headlights flickering just beyond the curtain as the car lurched down the road towards Dylan's new shelter. In a very eerie and unsettling fashion, those headlights flickered beyond the falling hail. The blinking in and out of sight reminded Dylan of starlight and how the night sky twinkled when you stood still long enough and stared up there in wonder. He took several steps back and looked up in suspicion. There's no way hail would cut through a road, a reinforced steel and concrete bridge, right? Ensuring he was in the exact middle of the underpass, Dylan put his hands up to his ears as the wall of hail approached. Giant ice balls bounced and knocked off the pavement, shattering into thousands of pieces. Some of those chunks looked bigger than beach balls, rocketing pieces of ice in every direction. His eyes widened as he began to realize the true size of this hail, and just how unsure he was about the integrity of his new shelter. Those weather predictions were wrong. They had underestimated the size of this hailstorm. For the first time that day, Dylan wondered if he would survive, and if he would be afforded the opportunity to see his parents ever again. Even with his ears plugged, Dylan could hear the roar of concrete resisting and cracking as it was slammed over and over by ice bigger than basketballs. Dylan ducked down when the hail wall reached his hopeful protection, fearing the bridge above him may buckle under the icy bombardment and collapse at any second. Chunks of ice flew in from the side as large orbs of hail struck just outside, fighting the earth and splitting concrete. Realizing he should have stayed in his truck, Dylan sprinted towards the front of his vehicle, keeping his fingers squarely in his ears. His upper body shielded from the crackling hail, Dylan felt ice pelting the bottom of his legs. Jeans had been a good choice that day. He was watching his feet amidst a spray of ice and water before his gaze was attracted up by a large rolling chunk of ice. This ball had been at least 2 feet across and was rolling along the ground. Dylan watched and almost laughed. As crazy as may sound, he almost laughed at this giant ball rolling in and out of the hail and vanishing on the chaos on the other side. The hailstorm was now squarely on top of the overpass, and any luck for survival was now a conversation of chance. A car horn began blaring, pulling Dylan's attention back behind his truck. He forgot about the other car. The headlights were not too far from the bridge, but the bouncing and cracking hail was so thick he could barely see the outline of the vehicle. There's no way the person inside would be okay by now. The crumpled car began honking erratically. What did they expect? Dylan couldn't save them? He walked to the side of his truck to get a better look. The car lurched forward enough he could see the front of the car now. Hail of all sizes piled into the car, breaking and bouncing off. The vehicle looked as if King Kong himself had played with this crumpled mess for an hour. It was immobile, the tires were all flattened, the engine was steaming, and the hood had been entirely caved in. Dylan wasn't sure how long ago the windshield had disappeared, but it wasn't there anymore. He saw the woman inside and thought he heard her screaming. Taking his fingers out of his ears, he now heard her screaming, and his ears rang with the overwhelming volume of the hailstorm. How could anything be so loud? His eyes winced from pain. His eyes fluttered with the spray of water and ice. An ice chunk flew up and hit Dylan on the arm, causing him to flinch. He put his fingers back in his ears and squinted. It looked like, did the car door just open? There was no way this woman would try. The next thing Dylan saw would haunt him until he passed away at an old and grateful age of 87 years old, many decades later. He would tell his kids for the first time, almost 20 years later to the day, about what happened next. His first wife would ask about this day from time to time, but his second wife, she knew not to ask about this at all. Dylan would always remember this moment as the saddest and most helpless moment of his life. He was able to forget plenty of other memories in his lifetime, but never this one. The woman attempted to run from her car and make it underneath the bridge. Her car had crumpled underneath the onslaught of the giant hailstones. She had been screaming for his help, but when the young boy didn't hear her, the woman decided to make a run for it. Hopping out of the car, she began sprinting with her hands above her head. She had about 40 feet between her front fender and the bridge, but about halfway, only a few more seconds from shelter underneath the overpass, she stopped running. Dylan watched the woman get struck in the head by a hailstone the size of a volleyball. She went down, limp. There was no extra step, no more effort, no yelp. That hailstone ended her life, and it did not break, but instead seemed to lullaby her head straight to the ground. The ball rolled away from her, one side of the ice covered in blood. The young man watched in horror as this woman's body was pelted again and again and again by pieces of hail, some much bigger than the piece that stopped her from breathing. He began crying, wishing he had already looked away. Why hadn't he helped her? Dylan could have backed his truck up to get her. What the hell was he doing? The first spray of red from the woman's body made Dylan jolt in disgust and fear. His subconscious realized it was time to disconnect from this situation and get in the truck without asking Dylan's permission. He began to fade, losing vision. The world closed in around Dylan, shrinking his awareness to absolutely nothing. Taking his fingers out of his ears, he rested his palms against the truck. His left hand shook and fumbled with the door latch of the truck, eventually finding it. The sound of hailstorm seemed miles away. He yanked the door open just before doubling over and vomiting. He thought for a moment he was going to pass out, but never lost consciousness. Wiping his mouth, he used his hands to pull himself toward the cab of his truck. He climbed in and pulled the door shut, dimly aware that he was even doing anything. He laid across his seat and began crying. Eventually, Dylan passed out, lost into nothingness away from this storm and utter terror. The overpass above Dylan would get chipped and cracked in the hail onslaught, but wouldn't completely crumble or break. When Dylan came to a few minutes later, the hail had completely passed and the most intense fog that Houston had ever experienced begun slipping through the city as all of the hail popped and melted. He wouldn't remember ever getting into the truck or when he threw up. Dylan would remember the woman being pelted from the heavens with giant chunks of perfectly smooth ice orbs until her body surrendered and crumbled into a soup sack. The last time he would talk about this event with his therapist would be on his 46th birthday. Dylan talked about that day a lot after his first day of being 47 years old. But on the passing day of his 46th year completed, he was finally able to forgive himself for his lack of action that afternoon. His PTSD would follow Dylan for quite some time, but he would never forget what he saw and how that day made him feel. The noise, the destroyed vehicle, her screaming, how close she had been to survival, and how close he had been to death. That woman could have been Dylan if he had left the house 5 minutes later, or if he had lost control of his truck. That could have easily been his body ravaged by hailstones. He could have been taken from the world by the largest hailstorm ever recorded in the world, like many, many other people. The death toll is still climbing now, a year since the incident. Some say it will reach over 1 million. With the numbers hovering around 900,000 at this point, it's likely. The entire southern coast is under repair. Cars were hammered into remnants of themselves. Homes were penetrated. Roofs were littered with holes. Many small businesses have addressed their damages and now are not sure where to go from here. Places like Houston were the most unfortunate. If a tornado displaced someone's shelter and they survived the tornado itself, the hail damage probably got them. Windows were blown out by cracking hail debris. There are entire websites now devoted to missing persons who have not been found yet. It's best not to go looking through those websites unless it's absolutely necessary. The numbers and the faces will overwhelm you. Paulo Coelho, a Brazilian novelist, said it best. Quote, "Most storms I have seen in my life have caught me by surprise, so I had to learn very quickly to look further and understand that I am not capable of controlling the weather, to exercise the art of patience, and to respect the fury of nature."
Thanks all for listening. Check out the next episode where we discuss and review this story. We hope to see you there, as long as the world doesn't end before then.
We would like to thank Kevin MacLeod for his music found on Incompetech.com.